Hey everybody, welcome back to the Gospel Echo podcast for episode number 7 with a very special guest, Bill Federer. Bill is a prolific author who's written over 30 books, most of which have to do with American history and American church history. He's an itinerant preacher who you can find him most Sundays preaching at some church somewhere in the country, and he speaks at different churches and with all kinds of Christian conservatives on YouTube. You can follow him on any social media, or you can find him at his website at americanpress.com. Here's the episode with Bill.
I'm honored to be with you.
Thanks so much. So I'm just random question. You texted and were you in Steve Bannon's war room?
Yeah.
Okay. The auto type changed the name, but I thought that's what you meant.
Yeah. Dave Bratt fills in for him from time to time, and Dave is a friend. So whenever he's on, he'll often ask me to be one of the people that he flips up there for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I've been looking at some of your stuff for the past few days, and you're a very engaging, interesting speaker, so I'm sure you get all kinds of requests for things like that. And I do want to talk to you about, obviously, some things about what's going on in America today and American history, but I thought I'd kind of start out, maybe you could tell us just a little bit about your testimony. When were you saved?
1981.
Wow.
Yeah, I was 23, and my wife to be, we were dating. Her She knew the Lord, and she was living with her mom. Her parents were divorced, and her mom would always have Christian TV when I came over to pick up, my date, my wife to be, and she'd always be inviting me to Christian things, and I'd always have an excuse why not to. I was prideful in my ignorance, right? I mean, here I'm a college student, I knew all kinds of, took philosophy courses, and I would try to, uh, you know, answer her. And she would just sort of look right up past that. She goes, "Yeah, but when you get saved, you're going to do great things." I'm like, "I'm fine, I'm fine." But finally, I ran out of excuses, and I went to a Christian businessman's dinner type thing at a smorgasbord place, and they had a speaker, Ron Tucker, a Grace Church in St. Louis. He was just in his probably 30 years old at the time, but I remember he got up and gave a talk, and he talked about Jesus like he knew him, and he talked about scriptures coming alive to him, and the Holy Spirit prompting him and leading him. He was using this terminology that I was not familiar with. And by the time he got done, I thought to myself, I can pretend like I know Jesus, but I don't know Jesus the way that guy knows Jesus, right? And so I went up afterwards, and I shook his hand and found out he was a pastor, and went to the midweek service. And it was the first time I ever heard praise and worship music. Um, I was raised in a traditional church where it was, a pretty non emotional type of singing that most of the men didn't even sing. Um, but this one was, they had the band, and they had the words up on a screen, and everybody was singing, and I was just caught up in it. I looked down at my watch, and an hour went by. I'm like, whoa. Usually at church, you're like, how many minutes before we can leave and get something to eat? And this was like, I was just, and then at the end of it, he had an altar call, and I went forward, and it's been exciting ever since. But
I bet. I bet. So, were you dating your wife at that point, or
yeah,
was
we
it
we
until when
dated
you got
five
saved?
years.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually met in high school, and um, she when her parents divorced, she some people at her school, uh, it was an all-girls Catholic school. And some of the nuns said, "Well, you need to go out to the convent, and they have a prayer meeting, and they'll lay hands on you." And she didn't know anything about it. And when they did, and they prayed for her, she started weeping, and she said she felt the Lord tell her that he was her father, and
Wow.
not the dad that had left with another woman. And so from that point on, they didn't, follow up with her necessarily, but she knew the Lord. And so we'd be, at a fraternity party in college, and she'd be somebody would talk about a struggle, and she said, "Oh, we need to pray for you, and God bless you," and it's like unusual for me and when BC before Christ to hear. So I'd say that she was as beautiful inside as she was outside, and but no, so we got married in 81, and then there was a verse that she found in the Bible that she felt the Lord was giving to her, that whoever leaves houses and lands and mothers and brothers and sisters for my sake in the gospel will get a hundredfold more, and this life, eternal life, and the life to come. And so she said, we're supposed to leave St. Louis. And so she had an aunt that lived in Tacoma, but we didn't necessarily go up to be with her. But we the day after our wedding, we packed everything we owned in a little green Gremlin and a U-Haul trailer, and we
Wow.
said goodbye to my family. I still remember my mom, watching us drive away, like, you don't have any jobs, you don't know where you're going, there's no health insurance, and we're like, we got Jesus. And we had our Keith Green music and our little cassette players, um, and we'd camp out along the way. And every town we'd stop in, we'd be like, you want to stay here? It's like, this is nice. Let's look at the next town, And went through Missoula, Montana, and, Wyoming, and then finally got to Seattle. And after being there for a couple months, we actually would open up a phone book and just pick out a church and just go to it. So we like went to all kinds of different churches. And but then we went to a Christian bookstore, and they had a flyer out that a speaker was coming for a crusade, and the person at the bookstore said, "Yeah, that's a good church." And so we started going to the church, and they had the same type of praise and worship as the one in St. Louis, and so we started going there, and then they said, "Well, we're having the speaker come, and we're going to need altar counselors," which we didn't know what that meant, but my wife volunteered us. And so they said, "Okay, Romans 10, 9, and 10. If you believe in your heart, right, that Jesus died and rose from the dead, and you confess with your mouth that he's your Lord, you shall be saved." And so they teach us these scriptures, and we'd be the ones behind the people that responded to the altar call. And then we'd go to it was in a school. And so they had like a classroom with desks, and they'd have them turned, and we'd, pray with the people and lead them through the Bible verses, and they'd cry and they'd get saved. And we were only 3 months old in the Lord, like, me anyway. My wife was longer, but and here we were, and then by the end of that year, we moved to Tulsa and found another church, and then my wife volunteered us to teach junior high Sunday school. And of course, in the denomination I was in, they didn't have Sunday school. So, I'm just winging it. The first class, there's Adam and Abraham and Noah, and this little girl raised her hand. She goes, "Noah came before Abraham." I'm like, "I'm okay, okay." I'm teaching the class. I mean, the kids knew more than I did, and so I'd
Wow.
have to study to not be made fun of in front of these kids. And I was working my job as an accountant for Santa Fe Industries in downtown Tulsa. They used to own the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. And it got bought out by Warren Buffett. And now it's Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BNSF. Uh, but after a few years, the youth minister left, and they asked us to fill in. They put me through the little Bible school, and then finally I had to make the decision to do accounting or do the ministry. And I thought, well, I can help other people count their money, or I can help some young people make some good decisions in their life for the Lord. And so we made the decision and transitioned. And anyway, there's a lot more to the story, but that's at least the beginning of it.
Yeah, so God sounds like he put you directly into the ministry from the very beginning. So I kind of wanted to ask you, at what point did you become interested in American slash church history? I mean, I guess if you weren't saved in college, church history didn't have too much to do with your collegiate background. How did that start to come about to lead you on the path that you're on now?
Yeah, well, my dad was an attorney historian. He was the head of Chatillon de Menil Mansion in downtown St. Louis, right across from the Anheuser-Busch Brewery. But it was the fur trapper. So St. Louis was the fur capital of the world in the late 1800s. They would have the roundup in the Colorados and buy the furs from the mountain men, and then they would take it to St. Louis. And it was growing until the King of England decided to wear a silk top hat instead of a beaver top hat. Like Lincoln had a beaver one. You take the beaver skin, you use mercury, some process, and you get to the micro black hairs, and so you'd have this these black top hats. But when the king switched to a silk hat, like overnight, the trapping of beaver dried up, and everyone was buying silk. So at that point in time, St. Louis stopped being the fur capital, and later Alaska became the fur capital. But so my dad was a historian. He was the head of the Carondelet Historical Society, a little French neighborhood that was founded about 5 years before St. Louis was founded. And so it was, oh, you had the French and Indian War in the 1760s, and the British win. And so all the French that are west of the Appalachians flee across the Mississippi River, and that's when St. Louis is founded in the 1760s. And so my dad was involved in history. We'd go on vacation, and we'd always stop off at a French fort, Fort Chartres, or a Spanish fort, or the Kit Carson, compound out in the west, or the Pea Ridge Civil War battlefield, or Medicine Hat. I mean, all these historical places. So I knew there was history there. But when I really became a Christian as an adult, it was like turning the corner on a cornfield and you saw the rows line up. And so all of a sudden, history made sense, and God had a plan. And the plan was that freedom could spread so that people could worship God freely rather than saying that they believed outwardly simply because they didn't want to be killed by a king, right? And then you could also be free to be what God made you to be and pursue your dreams and then be a blessing to others. And then what I really began to see was similarities between America and ancient Israel, the 400 years before they got King Saul. It's
Right.
called the Hebrew Republic, and that's what the colonial pastors looked to as the model.
Yeah.
But
And
but I
could
was
you,
teaching a Bible.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Bill.
No, I was teaching a Bible class there with another church we were helping with, and I started collecting God and country quotes, and then started doing research, and then printed my first book. It came off the press in 1994, and it sold 500,000 copies. And Focus on the Family sold hundreds of thousands of copies of it. Years ago, I talked with Dr. James Dobson, and he endorsed me when I ran for Congress. I did run for Congress a couple times, but they said that my book was their number one selling book for Focus, other than Dr. Dobson's own books.
Oh,
And
incredible.
so, and but then since then, I've written about 30 books.
Okay, so that's amazing that God used you so prolifically like that. You were talking about what you saw when you got saved and how history started to make sense and how God intended for people and nations to live. Can you describe for our audience the covenant form of government that the Pilgrims had and where it came from?
Yeah, yeah. No, thanks for that question. That's one of the main things I talk on. So the most common form of government is kings, and a king is a glorified gang leader. Right. So the default setting for human government is gangs. If you were to get rid of police, give it a couple days and you'll end up having gangs. And a gang leader with enough weapons we call a king or a pharaoh or a Caesar or a Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar, Maharaja, Genghis Khan. Right. Power wants to concentrate into the hands of one person. And it's a hierarchical system. If you're friends with that person, you are more equal. If you're not their friend, you're less equal. And if you're their enemy, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. And so it's a pyramid structure to society. And these kingdoms keep getting bigger because with the latest military advancements, kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon, an iron weapon, a phalanx spear the Greeks had, a scimitar sword that the Muslims had, gunpowder that the Chinese invented. The weapon keeps improving, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And with technological advancements, kings can track more people. And so Augustus Caesar, 2 BC, wanted a worldwide tracking system called a census. If he could have had access to 5G and cell phones and facial recognition software, I bet he'd been tempted to use that. And so they keep getting bigger until the King of England had the biggest. The sun never set on the British Empire. He had India, a quarter of the world's population, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, and America. And the King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy. And America's founders didn't like that, so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. So the word citizen is Greek. It means co-king. So kings have subjects who are subjected to the king's will. Republics have citizens, and the word citizen means co-king. And so Romans 13 is understood differently in a monarchy versus a republic. Romans 13 says, let everyone be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities exist and been established by God. Yeah, but when there is a king, the authority is the king. And so kings have subjects. But in a republic, the citizens are the king. So who's the ultimate authority in America? It's we, the people. Our
And
founders set it up where we, the people, and the politicians are our servants, public servants. You hire them, you fire them. It would be silly for a king to obey his servant,
correct. And
right?
let
So
me
when people say,
ask
"Oh,
you.
Romans 13, you got to submit to the government." It's like, well, in a republic, the government is our servant, and it's supposed to submit to us, we, the people, right? And
Right.
so when you understand that, it's the difference between pre-King Saul and post-King Saul.
Yeah, and let me ask you about that. There's often a lot of debate about whether the founding fathers were Christians or not. People say Jefferson was just a deist, not a Christian, et cetera, et cetera. Usually people are trying to make the argument that God shouldn't be involved at all in our political processes today when they're saying stuff like that. But would you say that the majority of the founding fathers were born again Christians? And if so, what impact did their biblical worldview have on the writing of the Constitution?
Yeah, so they were Christian. So I read through every charter of every colony, and every colony was founded by a different Christian denomination. Virginia was Anglican, Massachusetts was Puritan, Rhode Island was Baptist, Maryland Catholic, Connecticut, New Hampshire were Congregationalist, New York was Dutch Reformed, Delaware and New Jersey were originally Swedish Lutheran, and then they got taken over by the Dutch, and then they got taken over by the British, and Pennsylvania was Quaker. And they didn't get along, and they'd tar and feather each other. Their attitude was, if you don't like our denomination, fine, start your own colony. But then the revolution starts, and they all have to work together. I'm convinced if any one denomination felt like it could have defeated the king on its own, it would have set up its own denomination as the national denomination, which is what every country in Europe had. One denomination, it was all Catholic. Martin Luther starts the Reformation. And then you have Germany and Sweden being Lutheran, Switzerland Calvinist, Scotland Presbyterian, Holland Dutch Reformed, England was Anglican, and then, of course, Italy, Spain, France, Austria, Poland stayed Catholic. But in Europe, it was one denomination per country. And so in America, it was one denomination per colony. And so when the colonies break away and we're starting a United States, the fear was we're going to have one denomination try to be the national one. And so you had a pushback. And so they passed the First Amendment, which limited the federal government's involvement in religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. They didn't want, the fear was that, and you know this from reading the debates of the states when they were ratifying the U.S. Constitution, particularly North Carolina. And they said, well, some fear that the Anglican, which became Episcopal after the Revolution, that two-thirds of the original states were more or less Episcopal. And so the fear was that the Episcopalians would want to make theirs the national one. Well, then New England was congregational. And the thought was maybe the Episcopals and the Congregational team up, and so the Baptists and the Lutherans and the Quakers and the others will be. They didn't want a federal Walmart to come in town and put out of business their mom and pop denominations, and so I read through every state constitution. 9 of the original 13 state constitutions required office holders to be Protestant Christians. Right, flat out there, right? North Carolina, New Hampshire, every office holder had to be a Christian, Protestant Christian. You 3 states were liberal and said all you had to do was be a plain Christian. So Delaware 1776 said every office holder had to make a declaration of belief in God the Father, Jesus Christ, his only Son, the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore. I think, well, that's pretty narrow-minded. No, that was generous, because you could be a Catholic or a Protestant and say, I believe in the Trinity. Ben Franklin signed Pennsylvania's Constitution that said all you had to do was believe in God, creator and governor of the universe, rewarder of the good, punisher of the wicked, and acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. In other words, you not only had to lay your hand on a Bible to swear into office, you had to swear you believed in the Bible in order to hold office. But you could be a Catholic or a Protestant and say, yeah, I believe the Bible's inspired. And the one state that had zero religious requirements to hold public office was Rhode Island, founded by Baptists. They said if you required someone to be a Christian and they weren't, they would lie just to get elected, and that would be hypocritical and not pleasing to God. So we're not going to require, just vote for the best Christian person you know.
Right.
And then I read through every amendment to every state constitution. And in the early 1800s, you had an Irish potato famine. Millions of Irish Catholics come to America, and the Catholic percentage goes from 1% to 20% in a decade. So at the time of the founding, 98% of the country was Protestant. 3 million people, 98% Protestant, 1% Catholic. 30,000 Catholics in a country of 3 million people. Catholics were only allowed in 3 states originally: Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. I mean, Virginia, it wasn't until after the First Amendment that the first Catholic Church was started. And I think it was in 1797. And because prior to the Revolution, you had to be Anglican. And the Baptists got persecuted in Virginia. And so the Catholic population, and then at the time of the founding, 0.1% was Jewish. 3,000 Jews in a country of 3 million people. There was only 7 synagogues in the entire nation. And then in the then after the Irish potato famine and the Catholic population mushrooms to 20%, there was this backlash, and states were trying to outlaw, Catholicism. But then they settled down. And in 1835, North Carolina changed its state constitution from requiring you to be a Protestant to just requiring you to be a Christian to hold state office. And that allowed Catholics to hold office. And that's 1835. That's well after 1776 of the Declaration. It's well after 1787, the Constitution. It's well after 1791, the First Amendment. Here we got 1835, and they change it from requiring you in North Carolina from being a Protestant to just a Christian. And then 1851, Maryland changes its state constitution from requiring you to be a Christian, and it added, and if the party shall profess to be a Jew, the declaration shall be of a belief in a future state of rewards and punishments. Why is that? Well, there's a persecution of Jews in Bavaria, and about 250,000 Jews come to America and fleeing persecution, Ashkenazic Jews, and they go from 0.1% to 1% of the population. And then after the Civil War, many states rewrite their constitutions to say all you got to do is believe in God. But even that, it's God singular, so we're not talking Buddhism, Hinduism, and it is a God who believes in freedom of conscience, which means that it's not Islamic God, because the Islamic God wants outward compliance, not a freedom of conscience. So if you insult Muhammad, you get killed. If you're over in, some Middle Eastern Pakistan or something.
Yeah.
So
an obviously Christian founding, clearly, from the time of the Pilgrims and the colonies, at least when you're speaking in the 1830s, there's a Christian foundation to the country. And, a huge swath of the Old Testament is really just miracle stories. It's the Jews being outnumbered by giants as they took over the Promised Land. There's Gideon and his 300 guys, the angel of the Lord killing 185,000 Assyrians in one night, Jehoshaphat, the return to the land of the exiles. They only succeeded, all those people, because God intervened often miraculously, on their behalf. Do you know any miracle story of God's intervention in America's history?
Oh, yeah. My wife and I put together a series of books called Miracles in American History. And you have Squanto. So 102 pilgrims come across, half of them died the first winter. They would not have survived. But an Indian walks out of the woods speaking to them in perfect English.
Yeah.
His name's Squanto. He was kidnapped, taken over to Europe, sold as a slave, and after about a dozen years, finds a ship to drop him back off the coast of America. The area was all wiped out by a plague. A French ship had shipwrecked there a couple years earlier and wiped out the tribe. So had Squanto not been kidnapped, he probably would have died in that plague. But the pilgrims land on this spot, and Squanto knows the spot like the back of his hand, and he speaks English because he had been in England for several years, and he is their interpreter, puts them on good terms with the other Indian tribes, shows them how to catch beaver. It takes them 30 years worth of beaver skins to pay off their debt for their boat ride. He teaches them how to plant corn, catch fish, and William Bradford says he was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. And as he's dying, Squanto begs Governor Bradford to pray for him that he would go to the Englishman's God in heaven. Well, the Englishmen are the pilgrims, and they're Christians, and so I believe he believed in Christ. So, and another, you go to the Revolution. There's dozens of them that we put into the books. One, the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. A loyalist shows the British where to land and then march troops through Jamaica Pass, and they attack Washington from behind on August 27th, 1776. 3,000 Americans die, only 300 British. And then the Americans are pinned up against the water. And the next day they're going to get finished off. But the Continental Congress had a day of fasting and prayer. A fog comes in and allows Washington to take his army off. And when the fog lifts, the British charge, nobody's there. It was the last chance the British had to capture the entire American army all at once. Another is Benedict Arnold. He was a hero at the Battle of Saratoga, but he was going to betray America because his wife, Peggy Shippen, thought that the Americans didn't appreciate Benedict Arnold, and so she nags him and nags him. And by this time, he's in charge of West Point, and he's going to betray it to the British. It's the biggest fort that we have in America, and it's on the Hudson River, which separates the country in half because New England's on one side and the middle southern colonies are on the other. And it was going to be the day that Washington was coming to inspect West Point. We would have lost Washington. But at the last minute, the spy going back with the map is stopped by some American sentries. And they search him and they find the map of West Point hidden in his stocking. And they march him back. And Benedict Arnold flees on a ship called the Vulture that was waiting in the Hudson River. And you have the American General Nathaniel Greene says treason of the blackest dye was yesterday discovered. General Arnold, who commanded at West Point, was about to give the American troops a deadly wound, if not fatal stab, and happily treason was discovered right before it was hatched. And so here we saved the fort, we saved Washington, but they acknowledge it was a miracle that they caught this guy with the map in his stocking.
Yeah, but Bill, you never hear these stories growing up in America. If you go to public school or you go to a public university, at least, certainly, even if you heard the details of the story, it wouldn't be attributed to God's providence and his sovereignty. To what extent do you think the secular left has infiltrated America's public school system and its public universities?
Yeah, well, in the World War I and World War II, the Americans were victorious, and you had Lenin take over Russia, and then you had these Leninists, these Marxists that wanted to, defeat the West. But there was a socialist named Antonio Gramsci, and he gets on the wrong side of the other socialists because they want to conquer with guns and tanks. And Antonio Gramsci says, no, you'll never defeat the West on the battlefield. You have to rot it from within. It's going to take time. And the phrase was the long march through the institutions.
This is the Frankfurt School?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so this was this idea that you have to infiltrate the West and rot it from within. And they even list media, um, television, radio, newspaper, print, and education, the schools and churches. They specifically said they want to infiltrate churches and replace revealed religion with social justice and have the kingdom on earth rather than in heaven. That, uh, they wanted to infiltrate big business, like now with BlackRock, which, this asset management company that owns like 80% of the controlling interests in the top, Fortune 500 companies. The controlling interest is BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, these huge businesses that are all globalist leaning. And but they talk about, so in 1963, Congressman Albert Herlong read into the congressional record, so it's right there, the 45 tactics that the socialists had to take over America. And it was what I just explained: infiltrate the schools, infiltrate teachers' associations, use classrooms to indoctrinate with socialist uh, propaganda, use the schools as transmission belts for socialist teaching, the infiltrate the uh, different areas of what are called influencers, right? So they wanted to, and so they would do what's called critical theory, which was you come into a country and you identify all the groups, ethnic groups, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs, religious groups, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, economic groups, the proletariat versus the bourgeois, right? The working class versus the business owner,
Yeah.
the all these different groups, and you find the influencers of those groups, and you target them to pull them in your direction. And then you begin to influence the groups. And then you do something called critical theory, where you pit the groups against each other. And you organize protests and you organize riots. And the goal is bloodshed. Why bloodshed? Because then people think emotionally and not logically. Right? I just had my friend killed. I'm not going to sit down and talk logic. And then you want to channel that emotion somewhere. People want to blame somebody for it. So they get control of the media and they would use it to blame the leader of the country for all the problems every day. The leader's problem, the leader's fault, the leader's fault. And as the leader's popularity fell, then they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And this is the Cold War. And the Soviets did this, and country after country fell. And it's what's called behind the Iron Curtain. And then our CIA learned how to do it in reverse. And we had Operation Ajax, 1953, where we sent Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, sent Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt,
To
to
Iran?
Tehran.
Yeah.
And he organizes the mobsters and gangsters, and they organize riots and attack mosques, and then they co-opt the media to blame Mossadegh, their Iranian leader, for all the problems. When his popularity falls, they rush in, put him under house arrest, lock him away till he dies, and replaced him with the Shah. And so for 50 years, these Cold War proxy wars were being waged in third world countries, pro-America and pro-Soviet. And Obama turned it all inward. And so in 2015, he signed an executive order using behavioral sciences for the benefit of the American people. It's psyops. He authorized himself to be able to control the media to push his political narrative. And then in 2016, he signed Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which gave him the authority to decide what's disinformation and what rhetoric or narrative gets blocked.
Yeah.
And so he was using the tactics, the tools that we were using to overthrow countries overseas to help them to not go into the Soviet orbit. He turned those. Michael Waller wrote a book, how Cold War heroes became big state, spies. And he talks about how the heroes of the Cold War that were doing these tactics, now they're being used by the deep state against political opponents.
Yeah, it seems to me, Bill, that Americans are mostly, they adhere right now to one of two religions. I mean, there aren't only two religions in America, but I mean the majority adheres to either Christianity, and then on the other side we have the secular left who, they worship homosexuality and transgenderism, intersectionality, and all these other Marxist ideologies that we're being confronted with. How much danger is America in of becoming a pagan state ruled by a secular sort of authoritarian left that I know you weren't that last answer, you weren't talking specifically about America, but it sounded like you could have been just giving a commentary on what's going on now. How close are we to being in a pagan culture that's dominated by the secular left and is without freedom?
Yeah, well, they've definitely targeted the schools. They do a tactic called deconstruction, where you separated people from their past, get them into a neutral where they don't remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. It's a drive neutral reverse. It's a sales technique.
Yeah.
If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I would do would be to tell you a bunch of negative stuff about the toothpaste you're currently using. You're still brushing with that stuff? Haven't you read the latest article that it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? You're like, ooh, I'm repulsed by it. And now I have you in a neutral position. You're open-minded. What are all the toothpastes out there? I haven't been keeping up. And then I give you my pitch for this target-controlled breath freshener stuff. And so this is what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians. They sold people into slavery. They were chauvinists. They were bad, bad, bad until these kids are finally like, oh man, they're bad. I'm going to reject them. And now you got the kids in a neutral. They're open. Well, let's have a comparative religion class. Let's spend a whole lot of time talking about Islam and everything else. Oh, we just don't have time to get around to Christianity, right? And then they give them their pitch for socialism or LGBTQ or Islamism, and it works. You look at France. France went from 496 AD, when Clovis, the king of the Franks, was baptized on Christmas Day with 3,000 of his soldiers. France was a Christian country up until the French Revolution. And that's when they tore down churches and tore down statues and tore down graves and dug up the bones of Saint Genevieve. And they rejected their past. And then they got into a neutral where it's free sex, anything goes. And now Europe's becoming Islamist, with Muhammad being the number one name for newborns. England's becoming Islamist, with Muslims being the mayors of all these major cities. And I was just in Dallas, and there's Muslims that want to build a huge development with their huge mosques and huge shopping centers and have it be all Muslim. And they're like, wait a second, you're going to build. And that's what they did in Paris. They took over neighborhood after neighborhood and neighborhood in a big circle until they surrounded the entire city. And then whenever they decide to have riots, people are like, oh man, what do we do? And then they become a big enough voting bloc that they can swing elections one way or the other. And then people forget, all of North Africa used to be Christian. Right? Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt is all Christian. Egypt was Christian for 6 centuries until Amir ibn al-As invaded. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage. It was Christian until the Umayyad Muslims conquered North Africa and turned it into Tunisia. And then Syria was the first country to completely be Christian until Caliph Umar conquered it in 648 AD. And then Turkey used to be the Byzantine Christian Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were all wiped out by the Turks.
Yeah.
And so Christianity was wiped out of 2 continents. But it was this idea that they go from being Christian to this neutral. And there's like, oh, we're going to tolerate anything and we're going to tolerate everything. And we're going to let in belief systems that actually want to get rid of us.
And that's very interesting. I feel like America has gone from, I don't even know if we're in the neutral or just the post-Christian phase of this. I mean, we were a Christian country, as you said earlier. We have post-World War II, still pretty much a Christian country. But then in the 60s, we have a sexual revolution followed by a homosexual revolution. And then, I don't know all the things that happened from the 70s until 2015 when we've seen some of the more recent deviancies we've seen. But I don't even think neutral at this point. We're mostly post-Christian, and we just had 4 years of a completely open border, and we almost, the lawfare and sort of things that went on with President Trump, we almost, if that had continued, I don't know how long we would have survived. And I think God's giving us a reprieve and a chance to repent, which leads me to my question. What do you see as the key for Christians to defeat the secular left
When you put
in
the
America?
60s in America under a microscope, you mentioned, the 1960s and the sexual revolution. If you put it under a microscope, what happened was that Catholics and Protestants didn't get along. There was some lawsuits. In 1912, there was the Society of the Sisters in Oregon versus the governor, and they had Catholic schools, and then they had some nuns wearing nun outfits teaching in a public school. And they brought a lawsuit. They said, even if she's a great teacher, if she's Catholic, she's going to want to attract the kids to become Catholics. Then you had the terrible case of 1947, Everson. Some Catholic students were getting bus rides to their Catholic schools, and the Protestant state said, no, we want to stop that. And it went to the Supreme Court, and Hugo Black goes ahead and lets the bus rides continue. But he says, now the federal government's in charge of religion. We're going to take it away from the states. And then you had 1957, where the Washington Ethical Society wanted to be called a religion for tax purposes. And the court says, no, you're an ethical society. You're not religious. But Supreme Court says, no, ethical culture is a new religion. Religion does not have to have a supreme being. Like Buddhism and Taoism, they don't have like supreme beings, and they're just, and so then they said secular humanism is religion. Then there's the Vietnam War. And there's Elliot Welsh wants to be a draft dodger as an atheist and claim religious conscientious objector status. And the Supreme Court says, okay, atheism is religion for the purposes of draft dodging. And then you had a case called the Torcaso case, where a guy wanted to be a notary in Maryland, but he didn't want to say, so help me God. And the state constitution says, no, you got to say, so help me God. Otherwise, well, the Supreme Court says in Torcaso that religions don't need a supreme being, and that ethical culture and secular humanism are religions. There's even a case in 2005 where in the Wisconsin prison system, a guy wanted a room to look at male pornography and have a non-Bible study, Bible study, and the state said, no, you only get a room for religious purposes. And the federal court said atheism was Kaufman, that was his name, Kaufman's religion, and that so he gets to have the room. And so now we have the federal courts calling atheism, and so to not prefer one religion over the other, they kick God out. But by kicking God out, they are actually establishing the religion of atheism, and so they're violating the First Amendment. I mean, you have to admit they're pretty brilliant judges. They can twist. So here's Jefferson is the one responsible for writing the letter to the Danbury Baptists, where he mentions the phrase separation of church and state.
Yeah.
But Jefferson himself believed in a creator. He mentions the creator 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. But these federal judges can take Jefferson's words and twist them to prohibit what Jefferson believed. Well, we can't teach creation in school because we got to have separation of church and state. Well, Jefferson himself believed in a creator. And well, I mean, it's like it's beyond comprehension how they can twist things. But anyway, I think I went down a rabbit trail there. But
Yeah.
you begin to see how the gradual. So Catholics and Protestants didn't get along, and the answer was fine. I mean, even in World War II, 98% of the country was Christian, 26% Catholic, another 60 some odd percent Protestant, and 2 or 3% Jewish. And but they said, okay, the country is all Judeo-Christian. Let's just not teach. If we can't have it my way, we can't have it your way. Let's just not have religion in school at all. Period. It's like fine. It's like, well, you left a vacuum. And sure enough, into that vacuum came Madalyn Murray O'Hair in the 1960s, outlawing Bible reading and prayer. And then they outlawed that little 22-word prayer, God bless my parents and God bless my teachers. Amen. I mean, it's like so generic, but they outlawed it.
Yeah.
And so they left the vacuum, and into that vacuum immediately got sucked all these Marxist, leftist views. And the battle is who gets to teach the children. Your spirit, mind, and body. Your mind is like a super fancy computer. It's more than that, but it's at least that. And your body's like the computer case, which makes it silly for people to argue over what color the computer case is. Imagine if I were to say blue computers are better than red computers. It's like, it doesn't matter what color the computer is. What matters is what software is on it, what apps are on it. Doesn't what memory. Doesn't matter what color somebody's iPhone is. It's like what doesn't matter what color somebody's skin is. It's what behavioral software is running on their brain. Is it love your enemies and turn the other cheek, or is it cancel them, get them to lose their job? So the battle is who gets to load the software in the next generation's brains. And the other side wants to put corrupted files and viruses and malware on there. I mean, it's a normal developmental stage for little boys to play with little boys and little girls to play with little girls. But they go into the classroom and they say, well, if you're a little girl and you like to play with little girls, maybe you're a lesbian.
Yeah.
And if you're a little boy and you like to play with little boys, maybe you're gay. And so for their pre-adolescent stage, they're playing with their little boys and they're like, oh, I guess I'm gay. And they plant that seed that it may take decades for them to get that virus out of their head. It's criminal.
Yeah,
And
it really is.
and you know, you have to admit it's a pretty brilliant trick the devil's pulled
It is.
to
But
get
it's
to get
infuriating
Christians who
too.
believe the gospel of Christ, let their children be taught the gospel of Antichrist. It's like, what? Oh, yeah, our church, we're spiritual. We don't get involved in politics. We are so spiritual that we're going to let ungodly people teach our children that God does not exist, there is no sin, and there's no need for a savior. Undermining the whole
Ridiculous.
gospel. It's like it's the gospel of Antichrist. So here they are saying, oh, we believe the gospel of Christ. We're not going to get involved in politics. We're going to let our kids be taught the gospel of Antichrist. I mean, that's a pretty clever trick the devil's pulled.
It is. And you're sort of combating that by, I would call what's part of your ministry is your publications and the things you write. Could you tell our audience where they could find your material on all kinds of subjects, your prolific writer, your website, and places where they can find your information?
Oh, thank you. My website's AmericanMinute.com, AmericanMinute.com. I've got 30 books, got links to videos, also send out an email, a history email, and you can sign up for it. And it takes something that is going on today or some of the history of where things came from, but it always highlights faith and particularly the Christian faith in the Bible. So you get a little bit of the faith mixed in with history and the book Miracles in American History, where we go through, you know, Sergeant Alvin York, captures 132 Germans, World War I, and then he comes back and starts a Bible school. Lincoln had a day of fasting and prayer, April 30th, 1863. 2 days later, the South shoots one of their own best generals. Stonewall Jackson's coming back after the Battle of Chancellorsville, and it's twilight, and his own men shoot him. And every Civil War historian will say if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg 2 months later, the South very well would have won. Now, it's hard to reconcile because he himself was a godly person, but God didn't want the nation divided and he wanted slavery gone. But it was 2 days after Lincoln's National Day of Fasting and Prayer. You had Woodrow Wilson had a day of fasting and prayer when we entered World War I. Patton, during the Battle of the Bulge, our 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, and the Germans were demanding that they surrender. They were down to rationing 8 bullets a day. It was freezing cold. They couldn't even get their shovels to go through the ground to make a foxhole because it was frozen. And Patton's coming to the rescue with the Third Army, but the clouds are so thick the planes can't fly and give him cover. And so Patton has his chaplain, James O'Deal, compose a prayer. They print it on 250,000 index cards and pass it out. And the men pray it. The next day, the sky clears, the planes fly. They are able to march a huge distance in a short time, and they come to the rescue of the 101st Airborne, and the Nazis run out of gas, and 2 months later, the war's over. And but these are miracles in American history that we remind ourselves of. And if God did the miracles in the past, if we turn to him and seek his face, I believe he has miracles ahead for us in the future.
Amen to that. And I would say that just from gleaning from what I could from Bill's materials of the last week, if you're a believer and you're discouraged about what's going on in America today, you can see from his materials through America's history, God's sovereignty and his providence and his provision to maintain this nation and the way it is. And so he's in control, and you can really see that come through in Bill's recounting of what has happened in this country for the past 200 or 300 years. You can get his books on Amazon as well. You can just Google him. You'll find all kinds of things. And he's got lots of really good interviews on YouTube. We're out of time, Bill, but thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. It was a fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you. Anytime.
Thanks, Bill. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to Gospel Echo USA. Please remember to like this video and subscribe and follow us on all of our social media.